Sometimes we wait for God to speak in thunder, in lightning, in miracles that split the sky. But often his voice comes quietly, like a whisper carried by the wind, a nudge in your spirit, a story you didn't expect to find until now. And here you are. Maybe today felt like any other day. Maybe you've been moving through your life like a shadow of yourself, present but weary, faithful but worn. You smiled at others. You answered your messages. You showed up where you needed to. But somewhere inside, there's been a lingering question, a gentle stirring, a mystery your heart hasn't been able to name. Beloved soul, let me tell you something softly, but with certainty. That ache is not empty. That yearning is not accidental. What you feel stirring inside of you might be the beginning of something sacred, because sometimes, when the world is quiet, heaven starts speaking. Today's not about coincidence, it's about a calling into a mystery. A sacred journey hidden between the lines of history and found in the whispers of ancient truth. You see, there is a story, one that many have never heard, a story that stretches across time, beyond borders, buried in scrolls and protected in prayer. A story not erased, but veiled, waiting for hearts ready to receive it. And maybe your heart is ready now. What if there were years of Jesus' life that remained unseen, not because they were unimportant, but because they were set apart for something deeper? What if he walked a road that few have imagined, in lands not often mentioned? What if, during those so-called missing years, Jesus was not absent but preparing, listening, learning, loving, ancient Ethiopian texts, long preserved in reverence and silence, whisper of a hidden journey? A time in Jesus' life shrouded not in mystery for mystery's sake, but mystery for revelation's sake. And today we begin to open that veil. But this is not just about uncovering facts or filling historical gaps. No, this is about unlocking your heart, about receiving something eternal, because within this journey there are 15 spiritual keys. Keys that can unlock healing, clarity, peace, and purpose within your own life. Each one connected to the sacred footsteps of Jesus. Each one offering a light for your path right now. So stay close. Don't just listen with your ears. Listen with your soul. There is a reason you are here. Something within you has been asking questions in the dark, and heaven is ready to respond in the light. And if your heart already feels something awakening, even if you can't explain it, I invite you to respond with faith. Right now, take a moment and write these words in the comments below as an act of trust. Even in silence, I trust God's hand. Let your words be a seed of faith in the garden of heaven, because this video is not just a message, it's an invitation, a quiet knock on the door of your soul. At the end of this journey, we will pause together in prayer, not a rushed prayer, not a list of requests, but a sacred moment, a space where heaven can meet your heart, where you may finally feel the hand of God restoring what the world has worn down. And there is one more promise I want to make you. The final key we reveal today, the 15th one, may be the most important of all. It might carry the very truth your heart has been longing for, perhaps for years, the kind of truth that doesn't just comfort, but transforms. So, I say this to you with love. Stay with me until the end, not out of obligation, not because I ask, but because your soul might receive exactly what it's been waiting for. Now, if you haven't done so yet, gently tap the like button and subscribe to this channel. But more than that, join this community. This is not just a place for videos. This is a shared spiritual journey, a sacred space where faith is nurtured, hope is restored, and lives are quietly being changed. And now, take a deep breath. Let your heart slow. Let your thoughts be still. Because what you're about to discover could change the way you see Jesus? Could it be that the journey he walked in silence is the very path that leads you home? Let's begin. Key 1. Jesus was formed in obscurity before he walked in authority. They say Jesus disappeared. From the age of 12 to the moment he stepped into public ministry at 30, the Gospels grow quiet. The boy in the temple becomes a man with fire in his voice and healing in his hands. And we're left to wonder, where did he go? What happened in those hidden years? But in the mountains of Ethiopia, in a monastery where scrolls have been guarded for generations, there is a whisper, a quiet record preserved through the centuries by those who never doubted his presence, even when the world lost his trail. These ancient Ethiopian texts do not scream. They do not force their way into modern theology. They rest like sacred embers in the hands of monks who believed that silence too can carry divine truth. Among these ancient writings, there is a story of a journey far from Nazareth, of a young Jesus traveling through distant lands, sitting with elders, learning the deeper mysteries of God's kingdom and walking among people in need. Long before the world recognized who he was. The texts speak of Jesus learning the languages of man, not only Aramaic, but also Coptic, Ge'ez, and the heart language of the poor and forgotten. They say he healed in secret, that he listened long before he ever preached, that he sat in shadows so that he could one day walk into the light, not as a boy with questions, but as a man with answers carved in compassion. This is our first key. God forms his greatest vessels in hidden places. Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, was not rushed to a throne. He was led through the wilderness. He was tucked away in silence. He was prepared in private, long before the world ever saw his power. And maybe that's where you are right now. Maybe your life feels unseen. Maybe you've wondered if anything sacred could come from these silent years you've endured. The job that nobody praises, the obedience that nobody notices, the healing that's still in process. The faith that continues, even when no one else claps. Let me tell you what the Ethiopian scribes believed about those hidden years. They mattered. They mattered so deeply they were preserved in song, in ink, in the reverence of those who saw Jesus not just as a moment of public glory, but as a lifetime of sacred preparation. So let me ask you, could your wilderness be preparation? Could it be that the silence surrounding your life right now is not abandonment, but formation? Because if Jesus, the Son of God, needed years of hidden shaping, so do we. Imagine him in Ethiopia, standing beneath the vast open skies, learning the rhythm of prayer with monks who had never seen a miracle, but believed in the one who would bring them. Imagine him walking dusty roads, not to be seen, but to see. To learn the sorrows of humanity firsthand, to weep with those who weep, even before he ever wept for Lazarus. That's how heaven forms compassion, not in noise, but in nearness, not in platforms, but in presence. Jesus wasn't lost, he was becoming. And so are you. That is why this key is not about information, it's about identification. Jesus identified with the hidden, with the waiting, with the forming. And if you're in a season that feels long, obscure, or painfully slow, you are in holy company. Let this truth settle in your heart like sunlight rising slowly over dark hills. Obscurity is not emptiness, it is sacred ground. It is where God writes his most intimate lines. It is where Jesus was made ready, not in a rush of miracles, but in the quiet hush of devotion. So if you're still becoming, don't be ashamed. If your name is not known, but your prayers are steady, you are on holy ground. If no one sees your discipline, your tears, your pressing through, the Father sees it all, and he is not wasting a second of it. You are not delayed. You are being developed. And beloved, if this is where you find yourself, breathe deep, because you share a rhythm with Jesus himself. This key, this sacred understanding that God forms us before he sends us, may be exactly what your soul needed to remember. So stay near, because you are not behind, you are just being built. And sometimes the greatest ministries are born in the quiet. The most powerful words are spoken from hearts that have learned to listen first. And the most prepared souls are those who've walked long roads with God before ever walking before men. So if something in this message is stirring your spirit, I want to ask you to do something small but powerful. In the comments, write, "God, form me in the quiet." Let that be your declaration, a seed sown not in public applause, but in heaven's soil. You are not forgotten, you are being entrusted. And this was only the first key. There are still 14 more to come, each one peeling back another layer of the sacred path Jesus walked, and the one he is walking with you now. But let me leave you with this. What if the question isn't, where is God? What if the real question is, can I trust him even in the shadows? We'll talk about that in the next part. Key 2. God hides his glory to heal our vision. Have you ever stared at the sky in the early hours of morning before the sun breaks the horizon and felt like everything was suspended? Not fully dark, not fully light, just waiting. That's the moment just before revelation. That quiet pause where the world seems unsure of what's coming, and your heart beats a little faster, not knowing whether to hope or to guard itself. Maybe your soul is in that moment now, between what was and what will be, between the silence and the sound. But here's the mystery. In those moments when God seems most hidden, he is doing his deepest work. The ancient Ethiopian texts tell us that during Jesus' time away from public view, he often walked alone. He would retreat to caves, to hillsides, to rivers untouched by roads, but not to isolate, to align. There is one particular passage, recorded in fragments and protected in the monasteries of Tigray, that speaks of Jesus spending 7 days in solitude near Lake Tana. It says, he spoke not a word, but the wind obeyed him, and the trees bent in prayer. Can you imagine that? A silence so full of God's presence that creation itself responded. This is the paradox of divine hiddenness. When God hides, he is not absent. He is inviting us to see differently. That is our second key. God sometimes conceals his glory to correct our vision. Because you see, we tend to seek what dazzles, what affirms, what answers us instantly. But God is not always in the earthquake or the fire or the flood. Sometimes he is in the whisper. And to hear the whisper, you must come closer. To see the invisible, you must look with the eyes of faith. Jesus knew this. And that's why, in his hidden years, he chose not to reveal himself too soon. He waited, not because he wasn't ready, but because we weren't. God's timing is not just about preparation, it's about protection. He hides his glory, not to punish us, but to shield us, because unprepared hearts can mishandle divine things. And God loves us too much to let us be dazzled without being transformed. Maybe that's what he's doing in you right now. You've been asking, "Where are you, Lord?" And he's been responding, "I'm closer than ever, but I'm showing myself slowly, so you'll learn to see me truly." Think about how our vision changes in the dark. At first, we're blind, disoriented. But stay long enough and your eyes adjust. You begin to see outlines, shapes, movements, and finally, clarity. Spiritual vision works the same way. When God seems quiet, that's not rejection, that's refinement. He's healing the way you see, because there's more danger in a distorted vision of God than in no vision at all. The Ethiopian writings speak of a season of sacred veiling, where even Jesus would lower his presence among people so that they wouldn't cling to the signs, but open their hearts to the substance. And you, beloved soul, may be in your own season of sacred veiling. What looks like confusion might be calibration. What feels like distance might be divine protection. Because sometimes God removes the obvious, so we'll seek the essential. He dims the lights, so we'll stop chasing shadows. And if you're walking through a space in your life that feels dim, unclear, uncertain, hold this truth like a lantern. The God who hid his Son to heal the world is hiding something sacred in your waiting. He's not silent because he's distant. He's silent because he's near, and he wants to heal how you see him. This is why so many people miss the presence of God in their daily lives. They expect flashes and thunder, but God moves most often in stillness and surrender. So if you're tired of waiting, let yourself rest instead. Let the silence become sanctuary. Let the fog become invitation. Let the not knowing become worship. Jesus didn't rush to be seen, and neither must you. He knew that vision healed in silence becomes faith that endures the storm. And maybe what you need right now is not proof, but presence. So pause here with me, even if just for a moment, and say this gently out loud. Lord, heal my vision. Let me see you in the silence. If you feel led, write those words in the comments. You never know who else might be reading, searching, longing. Your prayer might be the doorway someone else has been looking for. Because we are not just watchers of this video, we are seekers of something deeper. We are travelers on a road that Jesus himself once walked, a road not paved in certainty, but in surrender. And as we continue to unfold these sacred keys together, remember this. You don't need to see everything to be guided by the one who sees it all. Stay with me, because the next key will take us even deeper into the heart of why Jesus waited. We've seen how God hides to heal our vision. But next, we'll ask, why does he allow delay, even when we are ready to be used? That's what we'll explore next. Key 3. Delay is not denial. It's a divine design. There's a kind of pain that doesn't scream, it just lingers. The kind of ache that forms in the waiting, when you've prayed, prepared, hoped, trusted, and yet the door stays closed, the answer doesn't come, the season doesn't shift. And you begin to wonder, is it me? Did I miss something? Did I take a wrong turn, or worse, has God forgotten me? Let me speak softly to that ache. No, beloved soul, you have not been overlooked. You are not late. You are not forsaken. You are being crafted. There is a phrase found in one of the Ethiopian texts, hidden in a poetic collection attributed to a desert mystic, that says this: "The river that waits in the rock does not rebel. It deepens in silence until the stone yields." Read that again slowly. Let it settle in you. The river that waits in the rock does not rebel. It deepens. Jesus himself knew this waiting. We often think of him as the miracle worker, the healer, the teacher, the redeemer, but before all that, he was the waiting one. He knew who he was long before anyone else did. He carried the weight of his identity while the world carried on in ignorance. He saw the broken and longed to heal. He heard the cries and longed to speak. And yet, he waited. Not out of weakness, but out of obedience. He waited because heaven's timeline does not rush, it refines. And that is the third key. Delay is not denial, it is divine design. You may feel ready right now. You may have done everything right. You may have surrendered, studied, served, and still find yourself in a place that feels like pause. But I need you to hear this in your spirit. God is not punishing you. He is protecting what he has placed inside you. Not all fruit ripens in the same season. Not all callings burst forth on demand. Some seeds take time, sacred time. Time that allows the roots to run deep, so when the winds come, and they will, you remain unshaken. Jesus waited 30 years to begin a ministry that would last only 3. Think about that. 3 decades of hidden faithfulness, of quiet integrity, of unnoticed righteousness. So when the time came to carry the cross, he didn't crumble. He didn't question. He had been formed in the fire of waiting, and maybe you are in that same fire, not the fire that destroys, but the fire that distills. The Ethiopian scrolls describe Jesus during those hidden years as the silent lamp carried through foreign lands, waiting for the oil to be full, so that when the wick was lit, the world would see. You too are a lamp, and God is filling you now. Not just with knowledge, but with patience, endurance, wisdom, grace. Because the moment will come when he strikes the match, and when he does, your light will burn with purpose, not pride, with healing, not haste. So if you're feeling tired of the wait, discouraged by the delay, let me ask you this. What if what looks like a pause is actually a pulse? What if, beneath the silence, something sacred is taking shape? There are stories being written inside you now, stories that need the quiet to be completed. There are people you're going to reach who need a version of you that's still being molded. There are moments ahead that require a depth in you that can only be formed in delay. So don't resist this time. Rest in it. Don't run ahead of God. Walk with him. He's not late, he's exact, and when he releases you, it will not be to strive, but to overflow. Let this be your heart's prayer today. Whisper it as you read. Father, if you are delaying, it's because you are designing something deeper. If that resonates with you, I invite you to write these words in the comments. Delay is not denial. I trust your timing, Lord. Your trust is a seed, and God knows exactly where he planted it. And as you hold this key, remember, Jesus waited, not because he wasn't powerful, but because the world wasn't yet ready to receive the kind of love he came to give. Sometimes the wait isn't just about your readiness. It's about the readiness of what will receive you. You are not being held back, you're being held together. And in the next key, we will go deeper into that love, a love so powerful, so patient, that it redefined what it means to serve. Because once the waiting ends, the pouring begins. So stay close. Something sacred is still unfolding. Key 4. The greatest power is found in hidden service. There are some acts of love that never make it to the stage, no spotlight, no applause, just quiet hands doing holy things, washing feet, carrying burdens, listening deeply, giving without being asked, loving without being seen. Maybe you've lived like that. Maybe you've been the one who stayed when others walked away, the one who prayed when no one else knew, the one who kept the faith, not because it was easy, but because it was sacred. And maybe you've wondered just for a moment, does anyone see? Let me answer you gently, and with truth that stretches across centuries. Heaven sees, always. According to one of the Ethiopian manuscripts preserved at Debre Damo, there is a passage that speaks of Jesus, not as a preacher or healer, but as a servant in silence. It says he labored among the poor in places where no one recognized him, that he mended broken tools, that he comforted widows, that he visited the sick not with miracles but with presence. It speaks of him bringing water to travelers at dawn, long before anyone else had stirred. And at night he would pray outside their doors, asking the Father to bless their dreams. No crowds, no sermons, just pure, unrecorded love. And from this sacred record we receive our 4th key. The greatest power is found in hidden service. We live in a world obsessed with visibility, metrics, attention. Being seen has become a currency. But in the kingdom of heaven, it's the unseen that carries the greatest weight. Jesus knew that. He didn't need titles. He didn't crave recognition. because his identity was rooted in the Father's eyes, not the world's applause. And if you too have been walking in that quiet obedience, unseen, uncelebrated but faithful, then hear this with your spirit. You are walking the same road as your Savior. He served in silence long before he served in miracles. He carried others before he was ever known as the one who heals. This is why heaven trusts the hidden ones, because they love without agenda, they serve without striving. They give without needing anything in return, and maybe, just maybe, that's you. Maybe your whole life has been a series of quiet offerings. Maybe your worship looks like holding your family together, or caring for someone who can no longer say thank you, or rising early to pray for people who'll never know your name. Let me tell you what Jesus said about people like you. Your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you openly. Heaven is not blind to your love. It is being written down, not in ledgers but in light, and that light is forming a crown you don't need to wear now, because your joy is in the pouring, not in the praise. In one particular scroll, the text says, "He became as the shade under the tree, that others might rest, though none asked who planted it." That was Jesus. And perhaps that is you too. You are the shade someone else needed, the prayer someone else didn't know they received, the gentle word that kept someone from breaking. Your love matters, even when no one sees, especially then. So let this be your affirmation today. I don't need to be seen by the world to be known by heaven. If your heart whispered yes to that, I invite you to write it in the comments. I choose to serve in silence because heaven sees. Your words might echo into someone else's life, a mother on the edge of exhaustion, a caregiver feeling invisible, a soul wondering if their quiet life has purpose. It does. Because the most beautiful flowers bloom in silence, the strongest roots grow underground, and the holiest love is often the kind no one notices, until they realize they've been carried by it all along. Jesus didn't just teach with words. He taught with presence. He didn't just tell us what love looks like, he became it in the most ordinary moments. So let this key sink deep. If God's power lived quietly in Jesus, it can live quietly in you too. And in the next key, we'll explore what happens when that quiet love meets resistance, when you serve and still feel rejected, when you pour and still feel empty, when you love deeply and it still breaks. Because even Jesus faced that. And what he did next might just be the key to your healing. Stay with me. This journey is only beginning to unfold. Key 5. Rejection is the doorway to a deeper love. There is a particular kind of pain that cannot be explained with words. It happens not when we are hated, but when we are misunderstood, not when we fail, but when we love well and are still pushed away. Have you ever felt that? Have you ever offered the best of yourself, your honesty, your help, your love, and been met with silence, or worse, with suspicion, distance, dismissal? There's a heaviness in that, a quiet grief that doesn't shout, but lingers. It wraps itself around your soul like a question. Was my love not enough? But what if I told you that Jesus knows that feeling more intimately than we can imagine? The Ethiopian scrolls, preserved by ancient hands who believed that even rejection can be sacred, speak of a moment in Jesus' hidden years when he returned to a village he had once served, a place where he had tended the sick, repaired roofs, wept with the grieving, and yet when he came back, they closed their doors. The scrolls say he was offered no bread, no shelter. The people whispered that he was strange, that he carried something different, something they didn't understand, and so they sent him away. The passage reads, "He turned not in anger, but in sorrow, and he prayed for their fields as he walked past their gates." That is love, a love that does not demand to be received in order to be true. And this is your 5th key. Rejection is the doorway to a deeper love. Because it is only when love is not returned that we learn to love like Jesus. Only when kindness is met with coldness that we discover what it means to carry compassion without conditions. Only when our hearts are bruised that we learn to let God be our healing. Jesus didn't withdraw his heart when they closed their doors. He expanded it, he blessed them anyway, and maybe right now you are standing at the gate of someone's heart and it's closed. You've tried, you've spoken, you've forgiven, you've been gentle, generous, available, and still there's silence. Maybe it's a family member, a friend, a child, a parent. Maybe someone you trusted deeply has shut you out. If so, lean in and listen carefully. You are not failing. You are being formed, because the purest love is not the love that is received. It is the love that chooses to remain gentle, even when it is rejected. The Ethiopian writings portray Jesus walking away from rejection, not as one defeated, but as one released, not bound by bitterness, but empowered by grace. And so can you. You do not need to hold anger in your chest. You do not need to become hardened to protect yourself. You can love and still walk away whole, because the measure of your worth is not in how others receive you, it's in how deeply you reflect the heart of God. And let me tell you, when you choose to love past rejection, heaven opens a door within you that nothing else can unlock. A door to the love that never fails. A door to peace that doesn't depend on outcomes. A door to Jesus himself, because he is closest to the brokenhearted. So today, if you are carrying the weight of not being chosen, not being understood, not being welcomed, give that sorrow to the one who stood outside closed doors too. He knows. And he is not only with you, he is in you, helping you love in ways that are not humanly possible. Whisper this prayer with me now, if you can. Jesus, teach me to love even when it hurts. Heal the wounds of rejection with your gentle presence. And if those words echo in your heart, write them in the comments. Let this moment become a place of surrender. I will keep loving, because that is who you are in me. You may never get the apology. You may never hear thank you. But you will receive something higher, a soul that is whole in God, a heart that cannot be hardened by the coldness of others, a spirit that finds joy, not in being received, but in being true. And as we hold this key together, remember, Jesus didn't stay at the closed gates. He kept walking toward the cross, toward us. Love doesn't need to be received to be fulfilled. It needs only to be released. And in the next part of this journey, we will uncover the key that sustained Jesus in every silent place, every painful rejection, and every delay of purpose. Because what held him together is what will hold you too. But ask yourself this before we move on. What if the love you gave was never wasted, but planted? And what if its fruit will grow in a season you've yet to see? That's the next door we'll open. Stay close. Something is still unfolding, and your heart is being made whole in the process. Key 6. Intimacy with the Father is built in the unseen hours. Have you ever noticed how the quietest hours of the day are also the most honest? Before the world wakes, before the noise rises, before we put on the version of ourselves that others expect to see. It's in those early, hushed moments, when you're still barefoot, still tangled in questions, still wondering if God is near, that the truest intimacy can begin. Not the kind built on perfect prayers or emotional highs, but the kind born from being fully present and fully known. And maybe that's why Jesus often withdrew to lonely places, not because he was hiding, but because he was drawing closer. The Ethiopian texts speak of Jesus walking into the wilderness before the dawn. They describe him rising while others slept, sitting beside rivers that no one named, whispering prayers that had no audience but the Father. There is a passage preserved in the Kebra Nagast tradition that says, "He sat among the trees and spoke to the Father with no words, only silence between them, deep as the well of eternity." Can you imagine that kind of intimacy, where nothing needs to be explained, where just being together is enough? That is where Jesus found his strength. That is what carried him through obscurity, through rejection, through delay. And this is your sixth key. Intimacy with the Father is built in the unseen hours, not in the crowds, not in the miracles, not in the accolades, but in the silent, surrendered moments when your soul leans in and says, "Father, I'm here. I have no words, but I'm yours." If your heart has ever felt dry, weary, disconnected, maybe it's not because God left. Maybe it's because he's calling you deeper. Deeper than the surface of religion, deeper than memorized phrases, deeper than expectations, into a place where there's no pressure to perform, only the freedom to rest. That's where Jesus lived, and that's where he invites you now, because real intimacy is not rushed. It grows in stillness, and the most powerful prayers you will ever pray may never be heard by anyone but God. You may never write them down, you may never repeat them again, but they echo in heaven like incense. The Ethiopian scribes wrote that during Jesus' years of preparation, he spent entire days in quiet companionship with the Father, not always asking, not always seeking answers, but simply abiding. And that word, abide, is sacred. To abide means to stay, to remain, to dwell in the presence of God not as a guest, but as a child at home. And maybe, just maybe, that is what your soul has been craving. Not more noise, not more teaching, just presence. Just the gentle awareness that you are not alone, that your tears are seen, that your questions are safe, that your breathing is prayer enough. So if you find yourself in a season where there is little fruit, little clarity, little recognition, don't despise it. This is the soil of intimacy. This is the space where your roots go deeper than you ever thought possible, where your soul stops striving and starts receiving. And it begins, not with effort, but with surrender. Right now, right here, in the stillness of this moment, close your eyes and whisper, "Father, I want to know you in the silence." That is a prayer heaven always answers. And if you feel led, write those words in the comments. Let this be your altar. Let this page become holy ground, not because of what's written, but because of the hearts reading it together. Father, I want to know you in the silence. Let it settle into your bones. Let it guide your mornings. Let it become the doorway through which every other part of your life flows. Because once you taste this kind of intimacy, nothing else satisfies. Not applause, not clarity, not even answers, just him. And if you've ever wondered how Jesus endured the cross, how he forgave betrayal, how he loved the very ones who struck him, it's this intimacy. It's what made him unshakable. It's what gave him joy in sorrow, and it's what's available to you now. So stay close. Because in the next key, we will see how this intimacy leads to identity, how Jesus didn't discover who he was through external confirmation, but through quiet revelation in the Father's presence. That's the next door we'll open. But for now, remain here just a little longer. Let this silence speak. Let it draw you in. And know, beloved soul, you are not just known by God. You are wanted. Key 7. Your true identity is revealed in the presence, not the platform. There's something that happens when everything is quiet, when no one's watching, when no one's asking who you are or what you can do. It's in that place, that still, sacred place, that a voice rises, not loud, not demanding, but clear, and it calls you by name, not the name the world gave you, not the label of what you've done or failed to do, but the name God has always spoken over you, beloved, chosen, mine. This is what Jesus heard before any crowd ever gathered, before one miracle was performed, before the cross, before the sermons, before the wounds. He stood in the waters of baptism, not after he had proven himself, but before, and the Father said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And that changed everything. The Ethiopian texts reveal that before that public moment, Jesus had already received these words in private. One of the most tender scrolls tells of a night Jesus spent in the mountains of Gojam. He was alone, lying beneath the stars, fasting and praying. The scroll says, "And the voice of the Father came not in thunder, but in a still breath, saying, 'You are mine. You are ready, not because they know you, but because I know you.'" This is the seventh key. Your true identity is revealed in the presence, not the platform. In a world that tells you to define yourself by what you achieve, by what you own, by how visible you are, Jesus teaches something radically different, that who you are is not something you build, it is something you receive. And you receive it in the presence of the Father, only there, because only He knows you fully. Only He sees the child and the warrior, the wound and the wonder, the brokenness and the beauty, all at once, and still chooses you, still delights in you, still calls you His. Maybe that's what you've needed to hear for a long time. Maybe you've tried to prove yourself in relationships, in your work, even in your faith. Maybe you fought so hard to be accepted that you forgot you were already approved. Maybe, like many of us, you thought identity had to be earned. But Jesus shows us the opposite. He shows us a love that names you before the journey, before the fruit, before the applause, before the pain. And that love is not vague. It is personal, intimate, spoken to you like a whisper in the dark. You are mine. Those three words can restore a lifetime of insecurity. They can silence the voices of comparison. They can anchor your soul when the world shifts around you. Because once you know who you are in God, no rejection can erase it. No failure can redefine it. No silence can steal it. And if you're in a season where everything feels hidden, where nothing is moving, where you're not sure who you're becoming, this may be the most important truth you could receive right now. You are not what you do. You are who God says you are. And He says, you are loved, you are wanted, you are called, you are His. So let that truth sink deep into your bones today. Whisper it, breathe it, write it down if you need to. And if you feel it echoing in your spirit, I invite you to declare it in the comments, with boldness and tenderness. I am who God says I am, even when no one else sees it. Let that be your anthem. Let that be your freedom. Jesus did not need man to validate His calling, because He had already received it from the Father. And now you can do the same. You don't need to chase identity. You need to rest in it. Return to the presence, again and again, until His voice becomes louder than all the others, because only that voice knows the fullness of who you are becoming. And in the next key, we'll walk deeper still, into what it means to carry this identity through pain, and how Jesus bore His calling not only with power, but with tears. Because to be called is also to be broken. And from that breaking, something holy emerges. But before we move on, pause here with me. What if your identity is not waiting to be discovered, but simply remembered? Stay close. We're not done yet. Key 8. Pain doesn't break your calling. It refines it. There comes a moment on every sacred path when the light dims, when the strength fades, when the questions grow louder than the answers. It doesn't mean you've failed. It doesn't mean you've taken a wrong turn. It means you've stepped deeper, deeper into the path Jesus Himself walked. The Ethiopian texts speak of this often. They do not hide it. They describe a Jesus who wept in caves, who wrestled in silence, who bore the weight of a call that no one else understood. In one scroll it says, "He looked into the heavens, and his tears were not of fear, but of fire, because he knew what love would cost." Imagine that, a savior, crying not because he doubted, but because he loved so deeply, so fully, that it tore through his very being. And this is your eighth key. Pain doesn't break your calling, it refines it. Yes, you are called. Yes, you are loved. Yes, you are chosen. But that calling will take you through places that bruise the flesh to awaken the spirit. And if you're in one of those places now, if your heart feels raw, if your prayers feel unanswered, if your dreams feel too heavy to carry, let me say this as clearly as I can. You are not alone. Jesus was here too, not just on the cross, long before that. The ancient Ethiopian writings speak of nights Jesus spent alone after rejection, fasting not just for strength, but to understand human sorrow. They say he wandered the hills in silence after being accused unjustly, that he bore insults long before he bore the nails, because pain wasn't foreign to him. It was part of the process. It was the refiner's fire. And maybe it is for you too, not a punishment, not abandonment, but purification. Because pain has a way of stripping us of everything false, of burning away the need to be understood, of teaching us that God's nearness is not always felt, but always real. Jesus didn't just survive pain, he let it shape him. He let it deepen his compassion. He let it soften his voice. He let it stretch his capacity to love those who hurt him. And so can you. Maybe that betrayal wasn't meant to destroy you, but to make you a healer. Maybe that delay wasn't meant to punish you, but to make your roots go deeper. Maybe that heartbreak wasn't the end, but the beginning of a holier kind of love. Because only those who've been broken can carry a love that heals. And Jesus, the one who knew heaven like no other, chose to walk through earth's agony so that he could walk with you now, not as a distant king, but as a wounded companion. He doesn't just reign from glory, he walks in your grief. And when you cry, he remembers his own tears. So lift your face even if it's wet with sorrow and say this softly, "Jesus, use this pain to make me more like you." And if that prayer echoes in you, I invite you to write these words in the comments. My pain will not break me. It will reveal who I truly am. Because it's true. Pain peels away the surface. It exposes the gold beneath the dust. It reminds you that your strength was never in your performance, but in his presence. Let me tell you what the Ethiopian texts say happened after Jesus' loneliest night. He rose before the sun, and his face was marked with sorrow, yet his hands were still open. And the people came, not knowing they had rejected the very love that prayed for them. He loved them anyway. He served them anyway, and you can too. Not because it's easy, but because love like his lives inside of you. So don't be afraid of this pain. It is not your enemy. It is your initiation into a deeper knowing of the heart of God. And in the next key we will explore what happens after the breaking, when Jesus began to pour out the power that had been refined in silence. Because pain doesn't just form you, it prepares you for something eternal. But before we move on, pause just one moment longer. What if this pain is not proof of God's absence, but a doorway into his presence like you've never known before? Stay near. You are closer to breakthrough than you think. Key 9. After the breaking comes the overflow. There's a moment after the storm, after the ache, after the weeping, a moment when the soul, though still trembling, begins to realize something sacred. You're still standing. You've been through it, the waiting, the rejection, the pain, and yet something in you has survived. Or better yet, something in you has awakened. It's not loud, it doesn't announce itself, but it flows quietly, steadily, like a spring rising in the desert from a place you never expected, bringing life where everything once felt dry. The Ethiopian scrolls speak of this moment in Jesus' hidden journey. After his nights of sorrow and fasting in the wilderness of Axum, after being turned away and misunderstood, the scrolls say this: "He walked again into the village, but not as before. There was fire in his gaze and water in his hands, and those who had rejected him were healed without asking." Pause there. Let those words settle. Fire in his gaze, water in his hands. This is your ninth key. After the breaking comes the overflow, not the overflow that comes from striving, not the power that comes from effort, but the flow of heaven that comes only from a heart made soft through surrender. Because God doesn't waste pain, He transforms it. And when the time is right, when the breaking has done its work, the oil begins to pour. You begin to speak, and people listen differently. You begin to touch, and healing begins. You begin to live, and something invisible shifts in the atmosphere around you. Not because you are trying to impress, but because your heart has become a vessel that no longer leaks, but flows. Jesus didn't just emerge from silence with words, He came back with power. And that power wasn't just to perform miracles, it was to carry mercy, to embody compassion, to speak truth that was soaked in love. He returned not bitter, but bold. Not defensive, but discerning. Not hardened, but holy. And that's what happens when God finishes forming you in the secret place. You don't come out with revenge. You come out with revelation. You don't walk in with arrogance. You walk in with authority. And not the kind the world gives, but the kind that heaven recognizes. So if you're wondering when the shift will come, if you've been asking how long you must endure, hear this: you don't have to force it. The moment of overflow doesn't need your performance, it needs your presence. Just like Jesus, you will rise from the pain, not just alive, but filled with wisdom, filled with grace, filled with patience for others, and tenderness for yourself. And when that happens, the people who once questioned you may not even recognize you, because you've been with the Father, and it shows. So let me ask you, are you feeling the stirrings of something new? A strange clarity, a deeper stillness, a strength that isn't loud but stable? That's the sign. You're shifting, you're entering the overflow, not because you earned it, but because you endured. You stayed. You didn't run when it hurt. You didn't quit when it was quiet. You allowed God to do the deeper work. And now, the spring beneath the surface is rising. Let it come. Let it pour. You don't have to control it. Just stay yielded. Let your words be fewer. Let your steps be slower. Let your heart be open. The overflow will find you, because the one who planted the seed in your sorrow is faithful to complete it in strength. Say this softly if your soul feels it: I'm not striving anymore. I'm ready to overflow. And if you're ready, write it in the comments. Let this declaration become a release. My season of overflow begins now, not because I chased it, but because I stayed. Let your endurance become your offering. Let your tears become your testimony, because what's coming from you now is not borrowed, it is born. And in the next part of this journey, we will look at what it means to walk in overflow without pride, how Jesus remained low even when the power flowed through him, because the higher he went, the deeper he bowed. But before we go there, pause and ask, what if your breakthrough isn't something you chase, but something you become? Stay with me. The well is just beginning to rise. Key 10. The higher you rise, the deeper you must bow. There's a quiet danger that comes with growth. Not the obvious kind, not betrayal, not suffering, but a gentler, subtler kind. The temptation to believe that because God is flowing through you, it's about you. But Jesus never forgot, never confused the power in his hands with the posture of his heart. The Ethiopian scrolls describe a moment after Jesus had begun to walk in signs and wonders. People sought him out. They followed him across distances. They waited just to touch his garment. And yet, the text says, he slipped away after the healing and was found later kneeling near the river, weeping not for power, but for purity. That is the heart of our Savior. He never clung to the miracle. He clung to the Father, and that is our 10th key. The higher you rise, the deeper you must bow. Because elevation without surrender leads to emptiness, and visibility without intimacy leads to vanity. Jesus knew this, so he returned again and again to the low places, to the wilderness, to the garden, to his knees, not because he lacked power, but because he knew where it came from. And maybe now, as your own spirit begins to rise, as you begin to sense the shift, the growth, the flow, this is the reminder you need. Don't stop bowing. Keep your heart soft. Keep your hands open. Keep your eyes on the one who gave you the oil. Because the world will try to elevate what it sees, but only heaven rewards what is done in secret. Let your power be wrapped in gentleness. Let your voice be soaked in grace. Let your confidence be rooted in dependence. The Ethiopian manuscripts describe Jesus entering villages with power to raise the dead, yet choosing first to sit with children, or to bless a widow, or to ask for nothing more than a moment of rest under a fig tree. Because he knew he was not the center, the Father was. And if you're carrying something sacred now, a calling, a message, a gift, hold it not with pride, but with reverence. You are not just a messenger, you are also a servant, not just a light, but a reflection, not just called, but kept. And the safest place for any calling to rest is on a heart that never forgets where it came from. So bow low. Let worship become your breath again. Let the word become your home again. Let stillness become your strength again. Because the world does not need louder voices. It needs lower ones, souls that are close enough to the ground to hear the heartbeat of heaven. So whisper this prayer with me now, if your heart is willing. Jesus, teach me to bow as you bowed. Let me carry your glory with humility. And if those words move something inside you, I invite you to declare this in the comments. The more he lifts me, the more I will bow. Let it be more than a phrase. Let it be the posture of your life, because Jesus, even as he walked in power, never stopped kneeling. Even at the Last Supper, knowing the cross was near, knowing the weight he carried, he washed feet. Let that settle in you. The Son of God with a towel. This is how heaven defines greatness, not in crowns, but in serving. And in the next key, we'll explore what it means to carry that posture into battle, how humility isn't weakness, but a weapon. And how Jesus, even in gentleness, carried authority that moved the unseen realm. But for now, ask yourself, can I be trusted with more and still choose to go lower? That is the question humility asks every day. And that is the place where God meets us, again and again. So stay with me. There is more oil to be poured, and the next key will show you how to guard it. Key 11. What God gives must be guarded in the Spirit. There is something holy about receiving. When God gives a word, a calling, a dream, a gift, it arrives like rain after drought, like morning light after a long night. And we weep, we rejoice, we feel alive. But there is something even holier than receiving, guarding, because what is sacred will always be opposed. The Ethiopian scrolls tell of a time when Jesus, after ministering in a region near the Semyon Mountains, withdrew into solitude. He had just healed a woman who had been rejected by her family for years. The crowd marveled, they praised him, they tried to crown him, but the scrolls say he felt the pressure in their praise, and so he slipped into the caves to pray. He spoke not of the healing, but of his heart. and ask the Father to keep him from the pride that follows the miracle. Let that sink in. He felt the pressure in their praise. Not all applause is holy, not all attention is safe, and this is your 11th key. What God gives must be guarded in the Spirit. Because the enemy doesn't fear what you haven't received. He fears what's been planted inside you, and so he'll do anything to disrupt it, not by stealing it directly, but by contaminating it subtly, through pride, through fatigue, through distraction, through offense. He won't come with obvious weapons. He comes with seeds, tiny thoughts, whispers, moments, all designed to make you forget who you are, who sent you, and why it matters. That's why guarding your heart isn't optional. It's spiritual warfare. Jesus understood this better than anyone. Even in the height of his influence, he stayed close to the Father. Even as people shouted his name, he returned to quiet places. Even when offered kingdoms, he chose the cross, because he knew you cannot carry divine power without divine protection, and divine protection begins in your inner life, in what you meditate on, in how you respond, in how quickly you forgive, in how deeply you remain surrendered, even when success knocks on your door. So let me ask you today, what has God given you that you need to guard? Is it your peace, your purity, your purpose? Is it your family, your faith, your ability to love? Don't take it for granted. Don't assume it will always remain untouched. Protect it, water it, pray over it, fast when you sense it slipping. Return to the secret place, often. Because the greatest threat to what you carry is not what's outside of you, but what's allowed to grow within you. So say this with me now, softly but firmly. Lord, I will guard what you've given me, not in fear, but in faith. And if that's your heart, declare it in the comments. I will protect the sacred, even when no one else sees it. That posture alone can shift atmospheres. Because when heaven sees a heart that refuses to trade purity for popularity, it can trust that soul with more. And here's the secret. Guarding what God gives doesn't mean hiding it. It means honoring it. It means living in such a way that nothing distracts you from the presence. Because at the end of the day, the calling doesn't protect you. The intimacy does. And in the next key, we will explore what happens when your guarded life begins to carry weight in the unseen realm. When darkness begins to recognize the light inside you, and you step into battles you never asked for, but were born to win. But before we go there, pause and ask, am I still guarding what was once a prayer? Or have I let the noise steal the reverence? God is not calling you to paranoia. He's calling you to consecration. Stay near. There's more to uncover. And the battle ahead will require everything you've protected until now. Key 12. Spiritual authority is recognized before it's announced. Have you ever walked into a room and felt the atmosphere shift? Not because of what you said, but because of what you carried. Have you ever been silenced and yet felt seen? That's not charisma. That's not talent. That's authority. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that doesn't seek to be noticed. The kind that heaven gives and hell fears. The Ethiopian texts speak of this often. In one preserved scroll, a record tells of Jesus entering a village where a man possessed by tormenting spirits had not spoken or eaten in days. No one dared approach him. No one could calm him. But the scroll says, he came not with force but with stillness, and when the man saw him he trembled. "Leave me not!" the spirit cried, for it knew the light had come. And Jesus said nothing at first. He simply stood, and his presence was enough. This is the 12th key. Spiritual authority is recognized before it's announced. Jesus didn't begin his ministry by demanding respect. He didn't enter rooms naming titles. He entered carrying weight, because he had been with the Father, because he had surrendered in private, because he had been broken in love, refined in silence, filled in secret, and guarded by humility. And when that kind of soul walks into a place, demons tremble even when no words are spoken. And maybe that's where God is taking you now, into a place where your prayers shift atmospheres, where your presence breaks patterns, where your silence carries a message more powerful than 1,000 sermons. But here's what most people miss. Spiritual authority isn't about control. It's about alignment. It's not about how much you know, but how much you obey. It's not about how loud you are, but how surrendered you've become. You don't earn it by striving. You receive it by staying close to God. So let me ask you, have you noticed the shift? The way people come to you for prayer, the way your words linger, the way darkness no longer confronts you with intimidation, but avoids you altogether? It's not coincidence, it's consequence. Because when the oil flows long enough in the secret place, it begins to mark your spirit in ways the natural world cannot explain, and the enemy sees it, not with fear of you, but with fear of the one who lives in you. That's what Jesus carried, and that's what you are stepping into now. But be warned, authority attracts warfare, not because you're failing, but because you've become dangerous to the darkness. So stay anchored, stay hidden in the Word, stay under the covering of prayer, because you don't need to announce your arrival. Heaven already knows your name, and hell already sees the mark, just like they saw it on Jesus. When he walked into that village, the man didn't say, "Who are you?" The Spirit said, "Why have you come to torment us before the time?" Because authority doesn't need introduction, it just is. So speak less, pray deeper, move slower, listen longer. You don't need to prove what God has made you to be. You just need to walk in it. Say this softly now. I carry what God has placed in me. I don't need to prove it. I need to protect it. And if that truth resonates with your spirit, write it in the comments. My authority is not noise. It's alignment with God. Because that's the kind of authority the world is starving for. And that's the kind of presence hell cannot counterfeit. So now that you know this, now that you feel it rising inside you, you must also understand this. Authority without compassion becomes pride. Which is why, in the next key, we will return to the heart and explore how Jesus combined power with gentleness, because real strength is always tender, and the next door we open will lead us deeper into that love. But for now, breathe deep. You are no longer who you were. Something has been planted, something is rising, and it does not need applause to keep growing. It only needs surrender. Stay close. Heaven is still pouring. Key 13, true power is measured by compassion. There is a kind of strength that shakes mountains, but there is another kind that wipes tears. The first makes others tremble. The second makes them heal. And Jesus? Ile karagavos dois. The Ethiopian texts recount one of the most intimate moments of his hidden journey. It's not in the Gospels. It wasn't proclaimed in synagogues. It happened on a nameless road in a forgotten village. A child, disfigured by disease, abandoned by others, lay alone by the side of the path. No one would touch him. No one dared to look him in the eye. But Jesus stopped. The scroll says, he knelt before the child and placed his hand over the boy's heart. He did not pray for healing first. He prayed for comfort. And as he held him, the boy whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore." This is the 13th key. True power is measured not by what you can change, but by how deeply you can care. Jesus didn't come to impress. He came to restore. He didn't rush toward applause. He slowed down for pain. And when heaven's power flowed through him, it didn't come with noise. It came with tears. How often do we forget that? How often do we confuse greatness with being needed, or anointing with being noticed? But in Jesus, we see a different way. He healed through compassion. He confronted through compassion. He even wept through compassion. And now he asks you to do the same. Because your authority will only remain safe if your heart stays soft. You can walk in miracles and still miss the moment if your love grows cold. You can speak in tongues and still harm others. If your words lack mercy, you can gain influence and lose tenderness. So protect it. Protect your compassion as fiercely as you protect your faith, because compassion is not weakness. It's proof of maturity. Jesus was never more powerful than when he wept. He was never more holy than when he stopped for the one no one else saw. And now that he's placed his Spirit inside you, that same tenderness must remain. Even when you're misunderstood, even when you're tired, even when you're poured out. That's how you'll know it's real. When you no longer need to be thanked, to keep serving. When you no longer need to be seen, to keep giving. When you can stand in a room full of pain and still offer peace. Say this with me now, as a whisper of surrender, not performance. Jesus, keep my heart soft, even as you use me. And if those words feel like a mirror for your soul, declare them in the comments. Real power is tender, and I choose to carry it like Jesus. Let the world chase strength that dominates. You were made to carry strength that heals. Let them look for signs and wonders. You are becoming the sign, and your wonder is in how deeply you love when it's hardest. Because here's what the enemy fears most: a person who has power and yet remains kind, a voice that can silence darkness and yet chooses gentleness, a heart that has seen pain and still refuses to close. You are not weak for weeping. You are not broken for feeling deeply. You are strong because you've been with Jesus, and he is still the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, and overflowing with mercy. So as you carry this next key, carry it carefully, because compassion will open doors that power cannot. It will soften hearts that logic cannot. It will bring healing where no doctrine could reach. And in the next key, we'll go even further, into what happens when your compassion turns into intercession, when your tears become prayers that touch heaven, when your spirit no longer watches, but travails, because that is where transformation begins. But before we go there, pause and ask, can I still feel deeply, even after all I've endured? If yes, then you haven't lost your purity. You've found your purpose, and God is just getting started. Key 14. Intercession is the cry of compassion that moves heaven. Have you ever felt something so deeply that you couldn't put it into words? A weight in your chest, a stirring in your soul, a name that kept returning to your mind in the middle of the night. You didn't know what to say. You just felt it, and somehow you knew God was inviting you to carry something, not for yourself, but for someone else. That, beloved, is intercession. It's not a title, it's not a ministry role. It's the invisible cry of a heart that is aligned with heaven and willing to bleed in silence for others. The Ethiopian texts speak of Jesus waking often in the middle of the night to pray for people who had cursed him hours before. In one account, preserved in the writings of the East Wind, it says, "He stood beneath the olive trees, with his face toward the stars, and cried not for himself, but for those who rejected him, saying, 'Father, don't let their blindness become their ending.'" That is intercession, not just prayer, but identification, not just word, but weeping, not just asking, but feeling. This is your 14th key. Intercession is the cry of compassion that moves heaven. When Jesus wept over Jerusalem, he wasn't weeping for architecture. He was weeping for hearts, for souls, for generations who didn't recognize the day of their visitation, and he still weeps today through you. When you feel a sudden burden for someone you haven't seen in years, that's him. When you wake up with a name pressed on your spirit, that's him. when tears fall and you don't even know why. That's Him interceding through you. Because when you gave your life to Jesus, He didn't just save you, He indwelled you. And now His compassion flows through your bloodstream. You are not just a believer, you are a bridge. And sometimes the deepest prayers aren't spoken, they're groaned. Sometimes the greatest ministry isn't on a platform, it's at 3:17 a.m. in silence, when no one is watching but God. That's where heaven is moved. That's where chains begin to loosen. That's where mercy is born. Jesus didn't change the world only by preaching. He changed it by praying when no one else would. And you are called to do the same. You don't need eloquence. You need availability. You don't need a perfect theology. You need a heart that's willing to be broken for what breaks His. Because every revival began with tears, every breakthrough started with a burden, and every soul that returns to the Father was likely carried by someone else's secret groaning. Maybe yours. So if you've been feeling heavy lately but you can't explain it, don't rush to escape it. Ask instead, Lord, who am I carrying? And then, let the tears fall. Let the whispers come. Let the names rise up like incense, because He hears it all, the sigh, the ache, the unspoken, and He collects every drop like oil. You're not just praying, you're partnering. Say this now if your heart feels it. Jesus, let my heart become a place where your compassion can cry. And if this key touched something deep in you, declare it in the comments. I will weep with Jesus until healing flows. That is intercession. That is priesthood. That is power in its purest form. And in the next and final key will arrive at the moment everything has been building toward, the transformation that happens not in public, but deep within. A holy turning point, a final unlocking. But before we go there, pause, close your eyes. Let God show you who you've been carrying. Let the tears come if they must. You're not emotional, you're interceding, and heaven is listening. Key 15. The transformation was never about the stage. It was always about the heart you stayed. Through the silence, through the ache, through the unknowing, through the breaking, through the refining, and now, something inside you is not the same. You may not see it in the mirror. You may not feel it every morning. But the atmosphere around you knows. Heaven knows. Even hell knows. Because you didn't just listen to this message, you walked through it, step by step, word by word, and here you are, not who you were. Maybe still a little fragile, but no longer the same. The Ethiopian writings often end with a blessing, not grand, not formal, but whispered like a father's last words before a long journey. One final line preserved in the monastery of Lake Hake says, "He returned to the mountain not to be seen, but to give thanks. For though the crowds now knew his name, only the Father had walked with him through the hidden path." That is what this has all been about, not recognition, not arrival, not the moment others finally understand you, but the moment you finally understand who you've become in God. This is your final key. The transformation was never about the stage. It was always about the heart, because it was your heart that had to soften, your will that had to bow, your wounds that had to open, and your spirit that had to rise again, slowly, gently but truly. This was never a message to watch. It was a path to walk. And now at the end, I pray you see, you were not brought here to consume content. You were led here to become a new creation. And that becoming, it's already begun. Maybe it started in the middle of a quiet part, when a sentence pierced through your tiredness. Maybe it happened while you were reading with your hand over your heart. Maybe it hasn't fully landed yet, but something is stirring, something is alive. Let it grow, let it breathe, let it become a rhythm in your soul. Because what God has done here, no one can take. No algorithm, no comment section, no circumstance. It's yours, written in light, sealed in silence, alive in you. So say this one final time. not just as a phrase, but as a declaration of rebirth. I am not who I was. I've walked with God, and I am new. And if you feel that truth resting in you, write it below in the comments. Not for me, but for the person reading who doesn't yet know that they too are being changed. I am not who I was. God is making all things new in me. Let this page be more than a scroll of text. Let it become an altar. Let it become the place where something died and something holy began. And before you go, before you return to the pace of your day, know this: you were led here by God. You stayed because He kept you. And now, He walks with you from this place forward. So if this journey touched your spirit, if this path marked your heart, if this hour became sacred for you, there is more. Here, in this space, in this community. This isn't the end. It's a doorway. Other messages await. Other keys. Other moments of silence, breaking, fire, and restoration. And if your soul wants to keep walking, there is space for you here. This isn't just a channel. It's a shared altar of faith. So stay connected, stay available, stay surrendered, and most of all, stay soft, because the world is waiting for the version of you that was born right here in this sacred journey. Let the oil continue to pour. Let the tears remain holy. Let your life become a living key for others. You're no longer only watching transformation, you are living it.